Thanks, Furman, and thanks everybody for coming. I'm even more nervous because I'm coming after Joe and Cindy, who are both incredibly impressive. And let me just find what's up on the screen. Just my name. Okay. I think I also want to just shout out quickly to Cindy, because she's an example of a woman in architecture who actually tries to help other women in architecture. She sort of introduced me to a developer, Galliford Try, who then I convinced to team with me to go for a scheme in New Hall B, or part of the New Hall development, and that led to a really important project for me. And if Cindy hadn't introduced me, it was a London Olympic conference before the London Olympics happened. That project would never have happened. So we all need to help each other. Okay, we need to start. And the time is, okay, 2050. So I have to change the slide. So I'm not going to talk about my work. I'm going to talk about my life. This is just the only image of some of the work of the practice, but I'm not going to talk about it. I'm just going to leave you with that image. So I was born in Canada, in a place called Welland, and this is obviously a map of Canada and the US, and I think it's important to show it. I'm not sure if you can see, but I grew up right on the border. This is the border between Canada and the US, and most of Canada is lined up along the border of populated Canada, along the border with the US. And I think it's just important to mention that because the presence of America and the USA right on the doorstep was very present in my childhood. Sort of being in a country, a kind of young country, new country, next to a superpower in the middle of the Cold War, I suppose, was in my consciousness as a child. And so Welland, this small city, is here, and that's Lake Ontario up there, and here is Lake Erie, and this is Niagara Falls and the Niagara River right there, and so that's Buffalo, New York, and this is Southern Ontario. And the city I grew up in, you can't really see it, but it's there because it was the place where a canal was built to bypass Niagara Falls. And so the Welland Canal is where all the ships from overseas sort of transited the Great Lakes, got past Niagara Falls, and so there were always huge ships sort of passing through the center of the city. And that was also a really profound experience for me as a young girl. Sort of, I had to walk everywhere. My mother never drove me anywhere, and so I had to walk to various things in the center of town. And I have this memory of sort of approaching the lifting bridge over the canal, and being always terrified that the bridge was going to lift when I was on it, when I was halfway across it, and also being fascinated by the sort of little house that you can see at the top of the lifting bridge, and sort of wondering, does the bridge master live in that house? And he's going up and down every day as the ships go through. So Welland was kind of an industrial town, as well as having the canal. And I grew up in this house, which doesn't look particularly remarkable. It's a kind of typical late 19th century house that was extended in the 1940s, but it was sort of rambling and was a very important part of my upbringing because it was loaded with family history. My father actually grew up there. My grandfather bought that house at the turn of the century, and so it was a house full of kind of memories and ghosts. My father had left to go to university, met my mother in Toronto, and they ended up coming back to Welland. because my father was a lawyer, my grandfather was a lawyer, my uncles were lawyers, everybody was lawyers, and lawyers tend to run family businesses. So my father came back to join his father's firm. That's my father sitting on the front steps of our house in, I think, 1940, and that's me on the same front steps of the house in about 1970. 1972, something like that. But, and so houses, this kind of rambling house with tons of built-in drawers and closets and attics and basements. The basement was huge, and there were all sorts of relics in there of sort of the Second World War, the First World War. All my aunts and uncles, aunts were Wrens, but uncles and grandparents fought in the wars. And so there was this kind of, it was like a repository of memory and artifacts. And then the houses that a lot of my relatives lived in Northern Ontario looked something like this, sort of big timber frame houses with verandas, huge verandas that for me are a really critical part of any kind of housing. Architecture, you need to have that threshold space, you need that kind of semi-public place that kind of creates the filter, this sort of interstitial space of welcome between the public realm and the private realm. And it's just, I think, also an essential thing to survival in North America originally. If you didn't have that porch on the front of your house, you wouldn't meet people and you wouldn't have the opportunity to meet your neighbors. This porch is particularly amazing because there's a moose head in it. I don't know if you can see that. And as a child, I know a lot of architects talk about how they remember drawing, they just drew like angels from a very young age. I don't really remember drawing, but I remember having a wooden, these German play sets of houses where they come in a little bag and everything's made of wood. And we had these village, the wooden village, and I remember playing with these things and always being super frustrated because I never had enough pieces to sort of make a proper town. And, there was only one school and one this and one that. And I was the third child of three. And so, I don't know if any of you are the third child of three, but generally, you're kind of left to your own devices, and you sort of end up with all the leftover toys of your older siblings. So I had probably about a third of the number of objects that you see there to play with. But that, in a way, it was, maybe something was starting to happen. Another really important place in terms of home was this island in Georgian Bay, and this is in sort of northern Ontario. It's still at the very bottom of Canada, but it's where the Canadian Shield comes up to the Earth's surface. The glaciers scraped away all the earth in Canada, basically, and dropped it all on the USA, which is another reason why we don't feel happy about the USA. They got all the good soil. Anyway, the glaciers retreated, created the Great Lakes, and there's this incredible landscape that is really rocks, trees, and water that hasn't changed for literally millions of years. And my father bought a fishing cabin on this island in 1962, and I've basically gone there every summer of my life. And this place where I am sort of in the wilderness, properly in the wilderness, it hasn't changed in, since the 1940s, when the government stopped development of the land in Northern Ontario. It literally hasn't changed, and so it's a place I go back to every year. And like me, with my mother, my sisters, growing up sort of wild on the island in the summers, I've taken my children and my friends for my entire life. So it's another kind of home. Another really important experience as a child were these two, well, this book on the left, Freedom Train, which is the history of Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railway. And I think I was 8, I was 7 or 8 when I found that book in my primary school, and I remember reading it under my desk because I would much rather read than listen to what the teacher was saying. And it sort of, it opened my eyes to this unbelievable injustice of slavery, the history of slavery in America, and just the incredible suffering and kind of the problems of the world. The veil of innocence was lifted from my eyes when I read about the Underground Railroad. And then in the early 70s, I don't know if anybody remembers the World at War series. My father, well, both my parents were kind of historians, especially my father, a war historian, and the whole 26-part series basically reveals the entire story of the Second World War. And this is also a little bit unusual for a kind of 9, 10-year-old to be thinking about and learning about, but it was, I think, important and another kind of knowledge or way of knowing about sort of really serious problems, cultural, racial, societal problems that actually need to be remembered and cared about. And, you know, that history is something that teaches us lessons that we must never repeat. On the other side of the coin, it was also an amazing moment in Canada, the 1960s, and Expo 1967 in Montreal was sort of this, it was the 100-year anniversary of Canada, and it was a moment for Canada to show that we were a kind of world country, world city, Montreal. And you can see there was a geodesic dome by Bucky Fuller, a monorail, amazing shapy buildings that look strangely like a lot of buildings that are still being designed today, 40 years later. And this kind of image of you know, happy families in the sun, and everything was groovy because it was the 60s, and there was this incredible optimism. There was also the moon landings, there were sort of amazing things happening that sort of meant the future was bright. We were going to have an incredible futuristic life in this kind of land of plenty. And in a way, Toronto, which was much closer to my home than Montreal, was another sort of really big memory, I suppose, for me, was the kind of metropolitan character of Toronto. A lot of my relatives lived there. And Ontario Place, which was Toronto's answer to Montreal 67. This, again, a super futuristic series of pods standing on the water, a geodesic dome, a kind of water world. And it was a kind of really optimistic and sort of future-reaching moment. Another really important thing in my life, this was, again, also sort of before everybody watched TV all the time, obviously before the computers or the internet, music was really important. And this album, The Age of Aquarius, does anybody remember that? The Fifth Dimension. I mean, again, a kind of really uplifting. If you're ever feeling down or sort of miserable, just listen to The Age of Aquarius and you'll start to feel better. So music was a big thing in our life. But I guess another thing that I should mention, I don't really have family photos here because actually, interestingly, the 60s, women's liberation, the hippie era in 1970, my father decided to liberate himself from his household of girls, which was my mom and my 2 sisters and me. And so I don't have any family photos, and even though my father was sort of there somewhere, having another life, I was really raised by my mother, and after about 5 years after they split up, we moved to Guelph. And so I had which is a university city near Toronto. It's a bit like a Bath. It's a beautiful stone city with an actual urban design founded by John Galt in 1821. Very wholesome city. And I decided to become wholesome myself. And in high school, I played on every team. That's me in the middle on the volleyball team. And I played in the concert band, and I was thinking, I just have to find what I'm good at and go for it. And I really focused on skiing. I love skiing. In my next life, I'm going to be a downhill racer. So and I used to work weekends, so I could earn enough money to buy my Olin Mark IV skis and go skiing every weekend. So I was kind of searching, I suppose, for what I was going to be good at. I forgot to mention, too, when I left my house in Welland, I loved the house so much. It was so full of memories. It was kind of a huge, kind of like a place where I grew up, was more in the house than anywhere else. But I was also very free to just roam the city. And I did measured drawings when I left the house. I thought I have to record every room and measure it. And I drew plans before I really knew what that was. And so this is an image of my mother. So as I mentioned, I was really raised by my mother. I was the third of 3 girls. And she had a sort of deep love of history, of historic architecture. Whenever we went to Toronto, she would show us buildings like the Ontario Legislature, beautiful Romanesque building. She was an avid gardener. Her heroine was, many of the English gardeners. She sort of, I think she wished she was born in the sort of Bloomsbury era. And she was part of the William Morris Society and the Historic Society, and this image of her is the awards that were given out for restoration of buildings in Guelph. So even though she never said to me, you should study architecture, I was always being shown sort of beautiful places and buildings that exhibited craft and detail and, very much a kind of 19th century. Really, the 19th century is the only historic architecture in North America because it didn't really exist before that. But her kind of love of these places obviously had a deep impact on me. So when I was 16, I took a drafting course in my high school, which was very unusual, architectural design and drafting course, and I loved it. As soon as I sat down and started drawing, this is it. I know this is what I want to do. So that was at age 16. So I knew from then on what to focus my energy on, and I ended up applying to architecture schools and going to University of Waterloo. And this list here is a list of all the books we had to read in the first few years of architecture school as part of the the iconography course, cultural history stream, which was a really, really important part of the kind of pedagogical direction of Waterloo. It was sort of design studio was one element, and the other was cultural history. And so, starting with the 20th century, the wasteland, the trial, the revolt of the masses, all quiet on the Western Front. Basically, we had to read a book a week and then write a 20-minute essay test at the end of the week. And that sort of distilled or synthesized or argued what was the kind of intention of the book in the context of the culture and period and art of the time. And these were incredibly difficult tests. To write an essay in 20 minutes means you've basically got three sentences. You have to kind of respond to this a kind of distillation of the ideas that are represented by these works of literature. And so I suppose this has been a very, words, I think, are really important in architecture, being able to express your ideas with words, being able to write well. I spend a lot of my time writing, probably much more than drawing. And so this kind of practice, understanding architecture in the context of cultural history, of literature, of art. We didn't study architectural history, we studied cultural history. And so this had a huge impact on me, and I think was a good training. Waterloo was also very sort of attuned to the UK in terms of architectural education, the AA. And here is an actual newsletter from Waterloo for a lecture. It's a kind of general newsletter, and it's announcing a lecture by Rem with this is Rem's look in 1982. And he hadn't built anything yet, but Delirious New York had just been published. And Waterloo was part of the schools of architecture in Canada that were sort of die-hard modernists versus the neoclassicists, which was the kind of ideological battle that was going on at the time in architecture. So I'm very much a child of the 90s when it comes to architectural theory, Delirious New York, as I said, but also the post-structuralist philosophers, Deleuze and Guattari, A Thousand Plateaus, again, had a huge impact on me. And the other reason for going to Waterloo was that in its fourth year, it has a Rome program. So everybody in the school goes to Rome for their first first semester of the fourth year. And in Rome, I had a sort of epiphany at Hadrian's Villa, and these are two images from Hadrian's Villa. Our first project was there, and I literally spent days and days exploring Hadrian's Villa and sketching, and for me it was a moment where I first understood architecture as something that could be very plastic, that Hadrian's Villa, because it's a ruin, you can see it's kind of an excavation and archaeology and earthwork that becomes spatial and becomes architecture, but it's also a place of the imagination because nothing is intact. So I had a kind of amazing experience there that I think just went into my subconscious because I was still kind of working in the mode of OMA and the other, even deconstructivism was a sort of new thing at the time. But my thesis project at Waterloo, which was a few years later, was a very different kind of project, which sort of went back to my roots. I decided to do a thesis about regeneration and housing, taking on one of the projects in Buffalo, in New York. So here on the left is the Ellicott district in Buffalo. So it was more or less an abandoned utopian modernist housing project with kind of like Ville-Radieu's sort of got started and never finished. And it was a place that was largely a black population, many, many empty and abandoned homes. And for me, it was a challenge to actually take on the kind of idea of the utopian modernist urban failure and try to kind of address it and reconstruct it through a kind of revision of that modernist ideal. And so I spent a lot of time researching local culture, local communities, building on the existing institutions that were there and coming up with a kind of strategy to over time renew and reintegrate this piece of this utopian void into the city, back into Buffalo. So in a way, this project represents a lot of what I've carried on doing with my career, focusing on housing and kind of addressing the segregation, the kind of social and class segregation that comes from the housing estates as they were designed and built in the post-war era. So after Waterloo, I decided to come to the UK. And this is, I think I felt, because I studied in a school of architecture that was co-op, you worked every other term. So you were in practice for 4 months and you were in school for 4 months. And so I'd worked in many offices in Toronto and other places, and I thought, I'm just going to leave Canada, spread my wings, take my portfolio, my 500 pounds, and my suitcase, and come to the UK on a 2-year working holiday visa. And I'm still here. I haven't gone back. So, and I think this was, I needed to kind of free myself from that sort of Canadian context and my family and all the expectations. I wasn't thinking this at the time, but now, when I look back, I think I needed to be free of all of that to kind of find my voice as an architect. Here is Bedford Square, the AA. Again, it was a place I knew. I'd come back to the UK in my high school years. I did a huge tour with my mother. And, you know, it's kind of the opposite of a North American city. It isn't a grid, it's organic, it's full of defined green spaces. And I had to find a job when I came to London. Sorry, this is just an image of Somerset House, sort of an example of the sort of great institutions that have adapted over hundreds of years. I talk about Somerset House a lot in my lectures, and it's where I had my 21-year party for my office. That's not my party. I wish it was, maybe the next one, maybe the 30-year anniversary, but it's a kind of cultural infrastructure that is, and the archetype of the quadrangle, which is something I always go back to. So I came to London. I'm probably running out of time. I came to London, and it was the recession. It was 1989, and everybody was leaving. I had a list: Peter Cook, Peter Wilson, Matthias Sauerbruch, Benson and Forsyth. I had a kind of list of, I'm going to work for one of these great architects when I come to London, but they were all leaving and moving to Germany because the UK was going into a huge recession, literally packing up their offices. And Matthias Sauerbruch had me in for tea, and the reason I went there was because he had been the project architect for Checkpoint Charlie while he was at OMA, and Checkpoint Charlie was one of my favorite projects as a student. So Matthias had me in for tea, and amongst the packing boxes, so literally tea crates and people packing the boxes, and he had me and he said, I know Ron Arad is doing a competition and maybe he needs help, so maybe you should try Ron Arad. So I said, who's Ron Arad? I've never heard of this guy, but I'll go because I really need a job. And so I went to this place, which is the old one-off furniture showroom in Shelton Street in Covent Garden. And it was literally pitch black, like it wasn't as bright as these images. And it was the opposite of an architect's office. And back here, behind that kind of piece of conical steel, was a tiny room where there were a couple of desks set up, and Ron and Christina Norton and Steve McAdam had put together this tiny little team. We're doing competition for the Tel Aviv Opera foyer architecture. And so they had me in, looked at my portfolio in this room that was pitch black with literally just one lamp over the center of the table, and I was sort of standing in the dark, and they were looking at it, and they said, yes, looks good. Can you start tomorrow? So I started working on the Tel Aviv Opera competition. Then when that ended, Ron said, I have some projects that are, kind of interior projects, can you stay on and do some more work? And so the little competition team left, and I was the only one left in the office. And so I started doing some interiors and lots of work in steel, a kind of mezzanine in Notting Hill. And then the lease came up in Covent Garden, and so Ron decided to rent a warehouse in Chalk Farm. And this is the Chalk Farm studio. It was an abandoned garage, and there's me with my husband, Charles Walker, in 1989, I think, or it might have been 1990, in the Chalk Farm studios. And that became a project that we did, sort of waiting for the opera project to start. And this is a tension fabric roof. It was Atelier One's first project, and it was our way of exploring what is a kind of soft architecture, complex geometries, and sort of challenging every convention of architecture. And here's me in the studio, and I'm drawing by hand that up there, which was the island in the Tel Aviv Opera. So a completely fluid, organic, mezzanine staircase amphitheater and an auditorium, everything drawn by hand. And so eventually that project was built and it was published, and Ron and I were on the cover of Blueprint, and this was the first time a woman had been on the cover of Blueprint. So thanks to Rowan Moore, that was a bit of an achievement. Ron and I used to go to a lot of art exhibitions as well, and I remember so clearly Rachel White-Reed's house, which was only lasted for 80 days, and it was torn down. And it was another kind of moment where I thought, this is such an expose of the kind of poverty of space that people live with in sort of conventional housing, houses that are broken up into flats. And it was so scary, it was torn down. It was such a shock to the system that it couldn't be kind of handled by society at large. And so that was a really kind of critical moment. And then I decided to set up my own practice so I could work in housing, work in the public realm, and sort of deal with some of the societal issues that I'd started grappling with as a young person, as an architecture student. But it's very hard to start your own practice when you don't really have a network, you haven't really worked in a conventional architectural practice. Ron Arad Associates was not conventional by any means, but I thought I could start. And so I started doing competitions, and luckily my name is A and B, Alison and Brooks, and so my name was right at the top of the list in the Yellow Pages. I don't know if you remember the Yellow Pages, but before the internet, the only way people would know about you was by looking you up in the Yellow Pages. So I had, after having the office in my front room for 3 years, I had 4 German-speaking architects in my living room because I had a hotel project in Helgoland, a German developer I'd met when I was with Ron, but we'd never done any work for him. Anyway, so that hotel project, which was on an island in the middle of the North Sea, so nobody ever saw it. So it was a little bit hard to build the practice on that project, but luckily a client who lived in Islington saw my name at the top of the list, and that client invited me to do a pitch for a house in his sort of weekend house in Malden, and that became the Salt House. And the Salt House won the Manser Medal. Even before that, the VXO house, which I think you saw at the beginning of the presentation, was, again, it was somebody I'd met when I was with Ron. It was the second phone call I made when the second letter I typed up on my classic when I started ABA was to this other client that ended up being the VXO house. And I remember Dennis Gilbert, the photographer who did so many of Cindy's projects, lovely man. He photographed the VXO house, and I thought, I have to submit this house for something. I have to get it published. And I found out about the RIBA Awards, and this was back in the day when you had to get a photograph, like a literal print, with the photographer's stamp on the back of the photograph. And I remember getting Dennis's photographs and stuffing them in an envelope and filling out the forms and jumping in the car and driving to the RIBA. And those big bronze doors were just closing, like they literally closed as I was running up to the doors for the deadline for submitting for the RIBA Awards. And I remember like buzzing on the bell and knocking on the door. And the porter came to the door and opened it a crack. And I said, can I please hand in my submission? It's a little bit late for the RIBA Awards. And that became the VXO house, which won an RIBA award and really was a ticket to every subsequent project. So I've run out of time. ABA 21-year party at Somerset House. So models, videos, films, and party lecture, published this book, Ideals Then Ideas, which states the 4 ideals that I bring to every project that I attempt to bring these ideals to every project: authenticity, generosity, civicness, and beauty, and to make sure that everyone has access to this in their everyday life. So this is the end of the talk, trying to bring those qualities that exist in nature: authenticity, generosity, civicness, and beauty. And I celebrated that at the Venice Biennale also a year or so ago. And finally, it's really the intention of those ideals is to make places where you can spend time with people that you love. Thank you very much.